Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to BASS and to the LBJ School. It's my true privilege and honor to be able to introduce Michael Gordon to you today. Michael is a good friend and colleague and somebody who I've worked with and sparred with over the years. But Michael is truly one of the most talented and experienced military correspondents that we have in the country today. He brings a rich understanding of international relations to an extraordinary set of personal experiences in covering military conflicts, and has developed an extraordinary set of relationships with people in and out of government to bring real insight into what's really going on behind the scenes. And he's here today in connection with the issuance of his new book, Cobra II, The Inside Story of the Invasion and Occupation of Iraq, published by Pentagon Books and co-authored with General Bernard Traynor. The work that he has done over the years, including his book on the General's War, and a number of studies that he has done for the Council of Foreign Relations and others, really has brought a lot of insight into the inner workings to understand not only how the military approaches the questions of its role in the post-Cold War world, but also the questions about how we develop our strategy, the relationship between the civilian and military side, and the way in which politics play out in these institutional arrangements. The book has obviously gotten a lot of well-deserved attention. It really does provide a very candid, but I think fair-minded assessment. It has really allowed people and the public to get some understanding of the challenges that we have in trying to deal with decision-making and carrying out of military operations in a very complex environment. And it's obviously going to have a very big impact, not only on the continuing debate in the country about the war, how we got into it, and what we should do now, but I think have a big impact on thinking in the future about how we organize our government, about how we structure civil-military relations, and what we should expect in dealing with future complex challenges like Iraq. So without further ado, let me ask you to join me in welcoming Michael Gordon from the New York Times.
Well, what I thought I'd do is talk for 20 minutes, half an hour, and then open it up for questions, comments, criticisms, have a little bit of an interchange, because I think that would be more interesting for everyone here. But I think I can lay out the main themes, and then we can have a bit of a discussion. First off, I'd like to explain a little bit as to how I came to do the book, which is General Traynor, who was a retired Marine three-star general and later went to work as a military correspondent at the New York Times. And I, after the Gulf War, we set out to do a book on that conflict. And we interviewed everybody from the guys in the field, the privates, the lance corporals, the generals. Spent a lot of quality time with the Defense Secretary at the time, Dick Cheney, and put it all together in a book that was sort of a history of that conflict. It's which is still in print and somewhere around 9,000 on the Amazon ranking list. But so when I saw that this war was going to come around, which was pretty evident to me by summer, fall of 2002, I pretty much decided, along with General Traynor, to do another book on this conflict. And this time, though, we had an advantage. The advantage I had this time is they had a procedure called this embedding procedure, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, where correspondents, they came up with a revolutionary idea that the people who wrote about the military and war would actually be with the military while they fought the war, which is really just hearkening back to the way it was done in the Second World War and the Korean War, and Vietnam, actually. So I decided to take advantage of that procedure, and I arranged to be an embedded correspondent in the Allied Land War Command. In fact, I was the only newspaper correspondent there. And it gave me a unique kind of window into how strategic level decisions were made by the generals, and also the interaction between the generals and Washington that I don't think I would have gotten elsewhere. And, they didn't share everything with me by any means, but over the ensuing 2.5 years that I worked on it with General Traynor, we dug up a lot of material. And so I stayed with this Allied Land War Command, And then in Baghdad, I shifted over actually to the 3rd Infantry Division, which was the Army force that took us to Baghdad, and stayed with them in Baghdad and went out to Fallujah with them, which was actually quite interesting. To be among the first units into Fallujah wasn't nearly as bad as it is now. Then I went up to Mosul in the northern area with the 101st Airborne, which was up there under Dave Petraeus. Went all around that area up to the Syrian border and back through Baghdad, so Bremer, Sanchez, all these people. And then came out through the south in the Marine area, because the south was then the Marine area, the multinational conglomerate was just sort of filtering in. And it gave me also an opportunity to visit almost all the principal battlefields in Iraq, and very often with the people who fought there, because what the Army did is they would try to reconstruct for their own purposes what happened at, the Kiffel Bridge, or places that are famous to the Army but probably not known to the American public. Objective Floyd. I mean, there were furious battles fought at these places. The notion that much of the American public seems to have that the war was fairly easy until they got to Baghdad is entirely erroneous. It was a hard-fought war. There were fierce battles along the way, and it was very well done, for the most part, by the U.S. military. But I was able to go to these places and have the very people who fought in these areas kind of point out what happened. That was because the security situation in the summer of 2003 was much better than it is now. And so you did have this kind of mobility. You could get around the country. These things would be unthinkable in the current environment. Now, one thing after doing all of this research that became evident to me is, and really very striking, is the extent to which these two sides who fought this war fundamentally misread each other's political strategy, intentions, and military strategy. The Saddam regime completely misread the United States, and certainly the Bush administration and the military strategy, and unfortunately we misread, or I should say the Bush administration misread the situation in Iraq. But if I was to start first with the Iraqis, we know a great deal now about what Saddam intended, what strategic decisions he made, when they were communicated. In fact, we know where he was day by day in terms of GPS coordinates. And the reason we know all this is his senior regime leaders and generals were captured after the war, and they were debriefed and interrogated and interviewed, and this has been reconstructed in a report by the put together in the Joint Forces Command, and I was able to access a classified version of the report, which I used liberally in the book, including some of the nifty maps about how Saddam escaped from Baghdad and how he wasn't at Dora Farms when we began the war and all this sorts of stuff. And the thing that's striking about Saddam is that Saddam really didn't see the United States as a threat. He saw it as a third-order threat. Saddam's principal concern was an internal threat. And, sometimes people say that Saddam he's irrational or crazy. I think that's not the case at all. He's very rational. He made understandable decisions. Granted, he was megalomaniacal and a tyrant and a very brutal person. But his concern was first and most internal. He was concerned with the Shia, that there would be a Shia uprising. And the reason he was concerned about this is there had been a Shia uprising in 1991 in the wake of the Persian Gulf War, and I was with American forces at that time at the end of it, and the Shia had, tried to challenge the regime and take over in Basra and Nasiriyah and Karbala and Najaf, all these places. And Saddam had to put that down pretty brutally, and that's the scenario that he was most worried about, that the U.S. would take some kind of military action, the Shia would seize on this as an opportunity to make their move. And as a consequence, he took a number of steps. One is he dispersed throughout southern Iraq thousands of paramilitary fighters known as the Saddam Fedayeen, who reported to his son Uday. He didn't trust a lot of people, so he put his sons in charge of the security, notwithstanding the fact they had no military competence whatsoever. And the Fedayeen were in all these southern cities in large numbers with huge caches of arms. And their role, first and foremost, was to suppress the Shia. By the way, the CIA didn't know the Fedayeen were in the southern cities in such numbers, which was really an egregious intelligence failure on the order of their wrong analysis of WMD. He did a number of other things. Because he was concerned with his internal security, that actually turned out to be against his interests when the U.S. attacked. He wouldn't let his generals blow up bridges, for example. To blow up a bridge in Iraq, you had to get the explicit authority of Saddam or his inner circle. In fact, there's a famous episode when American forces are moving toward Baghdad where General Hamdani, the commander of the 2nd Republican Guard Corps, is driving to Baghdad to get the permission to blow up the bridge, which he didn't get quite in time. So the policy, was why the policy? Because Saddam wanted to be able to use these bridges to send forces south if he needed to crush the Shia. And he remembered how in the Gulf War, when the United States bombed all the bridges, how difficult it was for him to move forces around to deal with the Shia. So he wasn't about to blow up these bridges unless he absolutely had to at the last moment. In addition to the Shia threat, Saddam was also concerned with another type of internal threat, the Iraqi military. He didn't trust his own military. If you looked at a map of Iraq prior to the war, you would see the regular army off on the Iranian border and up in Kurdistan, and see Republican Guard forces around Baghdad, but not in Baghdad. And one of the biggest worries Tommy Franks and the White House had, the scenario that bothered them the most, was that Saddam would pull all of his forces inside the capital and try to turn it into a bit of a Mesopotamian Stalingrad. In fact, they called this scenario at the White House, they called it Fortress Baghdad. It was a big worry for the White House. Well, it was an even greater worry for Saddam, because he didn't want to bring his own forces inside his own capital. He thought they conspire together, they might take him out, he might not be in charge. And so the Republican Guard was grouped around Baghdad, but not allowed in Baghdad. The only kind of conventional unit allowed in Baghdad was the Special Republican Guard, which was put under the authority of a guy who was a known drunk and failed military staff college, but was deemed to be loyal to the regime. So, again, internal security was his driving concern. It affected things in other ways, too. There's the 1st Republican Guard Corps commander relates how, the generals were not allowed to talk to each other because everything had to go through Baghdad because they could conspire. So when he wanted to determine where the sister units were in the Iraqi defense, this is during the war, he had to send out his reconnaissance units to find, not the Americans, but where the other Iraqi forces are, so he wouldn't bump into them accidentally. So it was a dysfunctional arrangement. Now, Saddam was worried about external threats, but the principal threat he was worried about was the same one that the White House is now so concerned about: Iran. That was his main adversary. Iraq had fought Iran for 8 years. Both sides had used chemical weapons against each other, although the Iraqis used it more. And this was a big worry for the Iraqis. And this was very important because it affected his whole handling of the WMD issue. Saddam's basic strategy on WMD was to allow the UN to come in and do whatever inspections it wanted to do, because he knew they didn't have much to find. And he thought that would deprive the United States of a casus belli and at least gridlock the Security Council. But on the other hand, he didn't want to entirely dispel the mystery over what he might actually have. His declarations to the UN were deficient. He wouldn't let a scientist be interviewed. He wanted to preserve some sense of mystery. And this was a strategy that General Hamdani, the Republican Guard general, later referred to as deterrence by doubt. Or Hans Blix, the UN weapons inspector, looking back on all this, later said, you don't have to have a dog to hang a sign on your house that says beware of dog. And basically, he was doing this because of the Iranians, because he knew that Iran, unlike Iraq, does have WMD programs and is a much larger country, and he really didn't want to let Tehran know that his cupboard was bare. And so it was a kind of a very calibrated strategy on WMD. It's perfectly understandable, completely backfired in the context in which he was operating against the Bush administration. Now, he did think that the Americans were a potential threat, but what the Iraqis essentially expected was a long air campaign, maybe some operations in the south. They never expected the United States to drive to Baghdad. That's reflected in these debriefs. That's important, not only because it's interesting historically, but because it shows that Saddam didn't plan the insurgency. He didn't plan the insurgency because he wasn't planning on leaving Baghdad. In fact, when I got to Baghdad, and I was living in one of these busted-up palaces with the Allied Land War Command, one thing that was really interesting is there was no furniture in this palace. The pictures were taken out of their frames. The silverware was gone because they knew that the thing would likely be bombed, which it was. You know, Saddam operated among safe houses, not among palaces that were obvious targets. But I later found this furniture, and it was in a kind of a warehouse building in the regime area. It would say, like, couch, second floor, third room to the left by the window, yes, a note on it in Arabic, or table from the second room on the third floor, you know, by the stairs. They were planning on moving all this stuff back. The idea was they were going to ride out this air campaign, the Americans would do something, they would maybe occupy part of the South, there would be some discussions through the UN, and the regime would continue. Those were Saddam's miscalculations. On the American side, the misjudgments made by the Bush administration were equally profound, unfortunately, for all of us and the people in Iraq. And, you know, recently, Condi Rice said that you may have saw her statements in the UK last week where she said there were 1,000, I think she said thousands of tactical mistakes were made. Well, General Traynor and I only identified 5, not thousands, but they weren't tactical, they were strategic. And, you know, I'll just tick off a few of them, and then we can open it up for discussion. But I think one thing that's clear is at the senior level of the Pentagon and the Central Command, they really misread the enemy in a military sense and misestimated Iraq in a political sense. And in a military sense, the enemy that General Franks and Secretary Rumsfeld prepared to fight was the Republican Guard. That's because we fought the Republican Guard last time. And they were deemed to be the most loyal and capable troops. And the theory was you defeat the Republican Guard, who were grouped around Baghdad, endure their chemical weapons, which everybody thought they had, take the capital, we win. That was the basic assessment. And in terms of the politics of it, they kept describing Baghdad as the center of gravity. It was a term that was used quite often. And the idea is you take the enemy's capital and you control the ministries and governmental structures. You not only end the war, but you actually acquire the mechanism through which you can govern the country, which is how Jay Garner planned on doing it. Well, the Republican Guard was not the only enemy. I would argue it wasn't even the main enemy. There were these thousands of paramilitary Fedayeen forces throughout the South who weren't about to quit once the capital fell. They didn't we knew these paramilitary forces were in the force structure. We didn't know they were so far south in such numbers or so fervent. And in terms of the political center of gravity, well, I don't think the capital of the country can be really the center of gravity in a political sense. Maybe if you're playing like a board game like Risk or something. But I think like, you know, the Sunni triangle was the center of gravity. And maybe the Iraqi population, unless you had their support, you weren't going to be able to operate. So I think the misreading of the enemy is a big failing. Okay. All wars, mistakes are made in all wars. But when your original assumptions don't pan out, it's important to adapt. And I think the second big mistake they made was they failed to adapt. You know, in the first few days of the war, it became obvious to the people who were fighting the war that there was a different enemy out there. And there were very fierce battles in Nasiriyah and Samawa. And I quote in the book Terry Farrell of 37 Cav, and he takes the army force to the gates of Al-Samawa. The CIA has told them not only that the population will be receptive, which they might have been if the Fedayeen hadn't been there, but they might be prepared to conduct a parade, joint parade, which the CIA could film, and it would be an information op. And anyway, he gets there, and he's on the radio, there are no parades, and they're trying to kill us. And the forces learned very quickly that they were up against a different type of enemy, and they adapted. Initially, you know, it was a bit of a challenge. You know, who are these guys? They're not wearing uniforms. Are they coming over to our side? Are they just taking a few shots at us before they coming over to our side? But you know, it became clear they weren't coming over to our side, and the decision was made to fight in all these cities that we were otherwise going to bypass and take on these Fedayeen before moving to Baghdad. And you know, there was a very prescient, I recount it in the book, there was a very prescient Marine intelligence officer, Joe Apodaca, with Task Force Taro, which was the Marine unit that fought in Nasiriyah. And he's an intel guy. And he sent an email, classified email up the chain saying, you know, these guys were fighting here, and after they'd taken Nasiriyah, you know, we haven't defeated them. They've gone ground, and we're bypassing them as we move toward Baghdad. We're going to have to deal with them again. In fact, we're going to have to deal with them in Phase 4, which was the military terminology for post-war situation. And so there was an understanding among the more savvy officers that when Baghdad was taken, the center of gravity, and when the Republican Guard was defeated, the war is not over. There's some other force out there that's got to be dealt with at a minimum, which could morph into an insurgency or some such thing. However, back at the Home Office, back in the Defense Department, among Secretary Rumsfeld, and back at CENTCOM with General Franks, they read the battlefield differently. And they tended to discount all these reports from the field about the Fedayeen as little more than, they saw them really as little more than a speed bump on the way to Baghdad. They didn't understand why the Army officers were making such a big deal about them. And in fact, there's a famous episode that I've reported for the New York Times, but it comes out of a book, that when General Scott Wallace, the Army 5th Corps commander, reflecting the agreed strategy that all the three-star generals had settled on, including the Land War commander, General McKiernan, General Wallace made some comments to two embedded reporters saying, you know, the enemy we're fighting now is different than when the war game began, so we're going to have to pause a bit and deal with this before we go to Baghdad. Those comments were entirely uncontroversial in the field, but they produced a firestorm in Washington, and General Franks' response was he threatened to fire General Wallace. And General McKiernan had to fly to Qatar and talk him out of it, which he did. But the point is, you know, there was a bit of a shoot-the-messenger mentality at the senior levels of CENTCOM and the Defense Department. Instead of saying, wait a second, these guys are up, they're reporting there's a different force out there that's going to carry on. They're saying we didn't war game against this. Maybe we should make an adjustment to our plan. Their approach was, no, this is just a bunch of risk-adverse Army generals who haven't understood the military transformation that Rumsfeld's bringing to the Pentagon, and they're being overly cautious. Drive on. This was a very important miscalculation, because if you had understood the moral of Apodaca's email and the other messages from General Wallace and others, what you might have done is you might have sent additional troops to deal with the situation, recognizing that after you take Baghdad, you might want to control the Anbar province in the west, or maybe even seal the borders, so that the WMD you think is in the country can't get out and the jihadists can't get in. But instead, they did the exact opposite. They not only did not send more reinforcements, Secretary Rumsfeld and General Franks canceled the deployment of the 1st Cavalry Division, which was the last division in the flow under their war plan. And I know you've heard it said that the generals got all the forces they wanted. It's not true. General McKiernan and the commanders who were in Iraq wanted the 1st Cavalry Division. They wanted that one extra division. They didn't know what Iraq was going to be. They were uneasy about it. It was in the plan, and it was canceled, really without consultation with them. But, well, General Franks was the combatant commander, and Secretary of Defense is the Secretary of Defense. But I think the failure to adapt, you know, you can't blame them for the bad intelligence they received, but you can raise the issue of whether they might have adapted. I'm going to throw out 3 other factors, and then we'll just open it up. I think for a variety of reasons, we didn't have astute nation-building policies. You know, when I was covering the Bush as he was running for presidency the first time, I interviewed Condi Rice, who's a very intelligent, decent person. And she was explaining to me how in the new Bush administration, it was following on the Clinton administration, they weren't going to engage in nation-building the kind of way the Clintonites had. They were going to have a new division of labor in the Balkans. The Europeans were going to do the peacekeeping. The purpose of the U.S. military was to fight and win the nation's wars. And this was an attitude that was colored everything in the administration. In fact, Secretary Rumsfeld gave a speech a month before the war. It was called Beyond Nation Building. And the idea was that his argument was that, you know, if you make a big nation-building effort the way the Clintonites did, and people like Jim Steinberg and folks like that, that you would create an unhealthy dependency on the part of the host nation on the United States, and guess what? We'd never be able to leave. We wouldn't be able to leave quickly. So we're going to enable the Iraqis and transfer authority to them and support them, but we're not going to do everything for them. And there would be real discussions. Like there was a guy in the Justice Department who said, hey, there could be some disorder in Baghdad. We need to send 5,000 international constabulary to deal with this. This issue came up because he had Balkan experience. And the White House looked at this and said, no, we're not sending anybody. The Iraqis are going to be the police. Okay? I mean, that's good as long as there are Iraqi police. But what if the Iraqi police vanish? What if their police stations are looted and burned down to the ground? What if it turns out the police were never any good to begin with and had to be retrained? Where's plan B? There was no plan B. Plan B was they were going to send 50 assessors to go to Iraq and spend some weeks, and they would do an assessment and a report, and would come back to Washington, and then they would decide what to do. That was plan B. That doesn't work. And so there was no plan B, but people sometimes say there was, they didn't plan for the post-war because they overlooked these problems, or they didn't think about them, or they thought about them. The problems with the post-war planning and the nation-building effort was not the lack of a plan, it was having the wrong plan. It was having a bad plan that was based on optimistic assumptions, and not, again, having a fallback plan for which they could adapt. And then a last factor I'll just mention is, it's been much commented on, but the decision to dismantle the Iraqi military. Having not planned for nation-building, having not sufficient forces to control things, they sent in a viceroy to control things, Ambassador Bremer. He was going to take charge and show who's who, and he took a very forceful position by disestablishing the Iraqi army and building a new one from scratch against the advice of all the senior U.S. military officers out there who desperately wanted to keep the Iraqi army in some form or rebuild a new one very quickly because they needed a partner in this. And an action he also took without the knowledge of the National Security Advisor, unaware of the decision until it was announced, or the Secretary of State, or any input from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but with the approval of the Secretary of Defense. Not, to my mind, the most, orthodox way of doing things. And that was a bad decision. And so what happened is we didn't have sufficient troops for the post-war, had enough for the war, but not for the post-war. They off-ramped the 1st Cavalry Division based on a premature assessment that victory was ours. We didn't have any Iraqi troops because we disbanded the army and didn't want to recall them. We could have recalled them. They went AWOL, but you could have recalled them, but we didn't want to recall them. So now we don't have an Iraqi partner. And you put these two factors together, and what you had was emerging was a security vacuum. And then you had a population which many people did welcome Saddam's departure, but then they became increasingly disaffected because they had no electricity or public safety. And this was the environment in which the insurgency began to take hold. And at the end of the book, there's a lot about anonymous sources and journalists. I try to put as much of this as I could on the record, quoting people by name. At the end of the book, all the senior commanders who were in Iraq in the summer of 2003, they're quoted on by name. And they talk about some of these decisions. And their view is there was a window of opportunity in the summer of 2003. Had we had better policies, you would have faced more opposition than we anticipated, but it wouldn't have been this sort of virulent insurgency that we later confronted. That window closed at the end of 2003, and what's followed since then has been attempts to dig us out of a hole that we pretty much dug ourselves into. So at this point, I'm going to end this presentation, but open it up for your questions and comments and thoughts. But you got to raise your hand.
Does the Pentagon have plans for establishing military bases in Iraq in the long term?
I think the Pentagon, it's a good question. Everybody asks me that question. I think the Pentagon and the liberals critics, or I don't even think they're liberal critics anymore, the right wing has now become critical of the war too. I share something in common. They both want to reduce the forces in Iraq. It's become a crushing burden on the American military and on the Defense Department. So there is a desire to get those force levels down. And I would say the White House shares that too, particularly before the congressional election. And that said, we're going to be there for a long time. I don't see any scenario where we get out in a year or two or three completely. And when you're going to be there in a long time, either providing air support or logistical support or combat support, you got to have some places to operate out of. So I think we'll have to have some bases there because we don't get out of Iraq so easily. But I don't see the utility of having, bases there for the long run. And I don't think we went into Iraq to have these bases. We have these bases because we were unable to get out of Iraq. And I'm going to mention a fact to you that's interesting. And on April 16th, 2003, 1 week after Baghdad fell, General Franks came to Baghdad, and I was there when this happened. And he gave his commanders guidance to prepare, not to actually withdraw, but to prepare to withdraw all U.S. forces except for one division by September 2003. That was the plan. And it was on the strength of that sort of thinking that the president went on the aircraft carrier just a few weeks later and announced, major combat operations were over, what they called Phase 3. And the idea was that the multinationals would then come in and the situation would quiet down. So that was their thinking. They were projecting an in-and-out war, not move into a region and set up camp forever.
From what you're saying, it sounds like Tommy Franks bears a lot of the responsibility as well as Donald Rumsfeld. Do they disagree vehemently with you on this, or your theories, or have they backtracked, or?
Well, I presented a factual account of what happened, along with General Traynor. The off-ramping of the first cab, as a matter of fact, I talked about it with General Franks. His exact quote was in the book. He said, Don Rumsfeld decided that. And then immediately after he said that, I got a phone call from Rumsfeld's spokesman, Larry DeRita, saying, well, when General Franks said that, what he really meant to say was that he took that decision on his own based on his best knowledge of the situation, but recognizing the question of the defense secretary. But I think Tommy Franks had a lot of leverage and responsibility. He could have made different decisions. I did have an opportunity to speak with him in 2004. He didn't want to talk beyond that. I had an interview set up, General Traynor and I did, with Secretary Rumsfeld. Promised to us, dates were actually selected, and then at the very end, Mr. Rumsfeld canceled and said he didn't want to do any interviews for the book. So, I did have a lot of access to the people who worked with them, and I had access to notes of meetings. In fact, there are a lot of Frank's quotes in the book, because there are people who were at meetings that he attended who wrote down these quotes. He had a very earthy manner of expressing himself, so I was able to use virtually none of them in the New York Times, but they're in the book.
Sir, how much of what we knew about expecting an insurgency, our preparations for the insurgency, why were we not aware of the fact that Iran might come into play? Why did we not have an idea? Like, if we knew something about Iraq and how it was functioning, we should have known that there was this possibility of Shiites involved. Why did we not feel that Iran would exploit that situation, and why did our preparations to block that not take care of the insurgency that did end up happening? Whether it came from Iran or not, just why did our preparation for dealing with Iran not take this into account? And was Ahmed Jalabi kind of blocking our vision of that problem?
No, I think that, embedded in your question is an assumption that Iran is behind the insurgency, and I don't think that's the case. I think the insurgency is largely indigenous with some, because what does that mean? What's going on in Iraq is a struggle for power. And the insurgency is not directed against us. It's directed against the current government, which we're supporting. And so you have a contest for power among different groups in Iraq. I think that what I always wondered is, since Paul Wolfowitz and other people kept saying there are lots of terrorists in Iraq and the terrorists associated with Saddam, and the CIA took the opposite view, that there was no link between Saddam and terrorists, and certainly no link with 9/11. But I always thought, well, if the Defense Department thinks they're terrorists in Iraq, why do they assume the war ends once we get to Baghdad? I could never understand that. The other thing I could never quite understand is if there really are 950 odd suspect WMD sites in Iraq, and there were, shouldn't we have troops to go there before it gets away? But we didn't. And in fact, General Marks, Spider Marks, the intel officer for General McCarran, is quoted on this point in the book. He's now retired, but he's pretty frank about it. So, you know, I think they didn't anticipate the insurgency for sure. They were concerned about Iran. We did have some forces along the border, but we couldn't control the borders. And you know, what was really striking is, and many of you may recall, that at the Pentagon, it took a couple months before anyone would even say the G word, guerrilla war. It was General Abizaid who was the first to say that. It was in July of 2003. We produced a front-page headline in the New York Times and other papers that the man was saying there was guerrilla-style tactics. Because up to then, Rumsfeld was insisting there were dead-enders. Franks was basically preparing to retire. He was in the process of, and he was handing over. He was a bit distracted. So it took Washington a while to even recognize that they were confronting an insurgency in Iraq, and that was a really lost time.
Wouldn't, I mean, appropriate attitude for many of these warfighters is that they're arrogance, correct? You could say, I mean, like not.
You could say that. I just say they're based on optimistic assumptions.
I mean, but some are rather arrogant, and wouldn't if in fact there was this arrogance, wouldn't it be really a euphemism for the racism and imperialism of much of military intervention in the Philippines, Central America, the U.S., of looking down on these dark, brown-skinned, inferior people that we need to civilize and democratize? I mean, isn't there a history of racism and imperialism often behind many of these strategic interventions and occupations? And then, obviously, people who is oppressed and occupied will rise up. I mean, many Southerners here, Confederate Southerners, in fact, we have statues of these idiots on campus, rose up against many of the Reconstruction troops who came down here for. I mean, isn't that just a logic of any?
I have a different take on it, and again, I'm not, you know, I'm trying to perform the role of a journalist and a historian, I'm not taking political stands. I didn't get into in the book, is the war right or wrong, but I have a different take on it, if I can express a personal opinion. I think Iraq and under Saddam Hussein was a horrible place. And I talked to an Iraqi once in Baghdad, and I was talking to him, and I said, so what did you do? You know, trying to, you know, find out what line of work he is. And he said, well, I used to be an airline pilot, but I was in prison for 11 years. So, okay. What did you do to get into prison? He said, oh, I told my best friend I was, in a private conversation, I didn't like the bath party. And he said, I was in jail for 9 years, and then they let me out, and then they put me back in jail for 2 more years. And I said, look, you go to jail for 9 years because you said something, a bad word about the bath party. When you got out, what did you do to get yourself put back in jail again? He said, I did nothing. He said, I was just scared of my own shadow. But then they got suspicious and they put me back in again. That's the kind of place Saddam's Iraq was. And it was really a family-run business, and, you know, cult of personality. Saddam and his son's pictures were everywhere. You know, I think that a lot of Iraqis, the Shia were repressed. Saddam tried to use chemical weapons against them in '91. He did use chemical weapons against the Kurds. You know, it was, a lot of people were not unhappy to see Saddam dislodged from power. And I always thought that, you know, if you could get rid of Saddam and produce a good outcome there, that would be a better situation for the people of Iraq. If you could do that, if you can follow through.
So
well, I don't want to get into debate. We can talk after that.
Was a family dynasty that was horrible. FDR said he's the son of a bitch because he's our son of a bitch. And the Nicaraguans did not need the American military intervention to get rid of someone.
I'm not getting into debate on foreign policy. I'm just talking about Iraq.
Okay, it's great we got rid of the dictators, but there are tons of dictators all over the world. Why don't we get rid of them?
Because, well, first of all, it may come as a surprise to you, but I actually didn't order this invasion. And I'm just trying to, no, I'm explaining my perception of it. But then I also want to give other people a chance to talk. But I think that, well, you had somewhere in there was, I mean, there was another part of the question. I want to answer it apart from what you thought was imperialist. What was the other part of it?
racist.
Yeah, I don't think it was, and I think that, but I think that there were some, there was, General Abizaid, when he was a deputy commander, he's an American of Arab descent, in a private conversation, which I recount in the book, not with me, with other people, because he's sensitive to this, he said, we're going to be an antibody in that society as an American presence, even though we're doing him a favor by getting rid of Saddam. We're going to be perceived as an occupier, was his concern. And he said, we really need to internationalize this problem. It's a quote from him. We need to a Pentagon team. We really need to internationalize this problem, perhaps bring in the UN. It would be crazy to keep the U.S. government in charge for too long. That was the quote. Well, that wasn't the strategy that was executed. So I think we did become perceived as occupiers, and then there were some dumb things we did. Disestablishing the Iraqi army, I think, was a negative. Here's another one, and then I'll take the next question. After we intervened and the Marines ended up in charge of southern Iraq, and they had no job. Well, they weren't looking to have the job. They thought we were getting in and out, but they weren't getting out so quickly. So they did what they tried to organize elections in the job. The Marines don't want to control the job. And so they organized elections, and ballots were printed, and the whole voter education thing was done. And I interviewed the guy that did it. The Marines were very proud of it. They heard all these statements, the president, we're bringing democracy. Well, the Marines, well, okay, let them pick their own guy. We'll work with them. I mean, we'll make sure it doesn't get out of control, but we'll work with them. And so the intelligence developed that the guy who was going to win the elections was some kind of a radical or fundamentalist Shia type. Ambassador Bremer intervened and ordered the Marines to cancel the election. And the Marines were very unhappy with this decision. And I interviewed the poor guy who was the battalion commander who had to do this, and he had to go there and say, well, he didn't want to say, I've been ordered to cancel your election because we determined the wrong guy was going to win. So he said, well, we organized this, we were forcing you too long, we're not even canceling it, we're deferring the election, we're going to have it a little later, thank you for your interest. And then the Marines went to Baghdad and had a reclama, General Conway, the top Marine commander, to say, hey, wait a second, we got to let the people pick their own guys. And from a personal level, being shocked that a Shia is going to, a fundamentalist may win in a job is like saying, oh my God, a conservative Republican is going to win in South Carolina. We can't allow that. Who else is going to win in a job? But and Bremer didn't see him, and he met with some deputy. And in the back of the book, the Marines, when they cataloged the mistakes on the record, one of the big mistakes, they say, was the decision by the Coalition Provisional Authority not to let the people choose their own leaders. Because that's what made, that's what led to the perception the United States was an occupier.
I was wondering if you could comment a little further on the issue of the implications of embedded journalism for independent media. You mentioned that your role as a journalist is not to be political, and I'm wondering if there's a contradiction there, not being political and being embedded with one of the combatants.
Well, I mean, it's a good question, but the way I think of it is the following. If you cover the White House, you got to be at the White House. If you cover the Congress, you probably should go to the Congress and go to the hearings and talk to the lawmakers and watch them vote. So if you're covering the military, you got to cover the military operations. I don't know how else you cover it except by doing it. If you're going to do it, you're going to have to be embedded. If you're not embedded, there are people they call unilaterals, and they didn't stay unilateral all that long. I know some. They went into Iraq. They're intrepid people, and they would, but after being shot at a few times, they would curl up with find some Marine unit or Army unit and say, "Can we go with you?" And the guy said, "Yeah, go with us." And so they became de facto embedded. And some of the people refused to be embedded at all, like the British ITN television crew were killed in the first 2 days of the war because they got in between the Marines and the Fedayeen, and they were driving, guess what, SUVs, the favorite vehicle of the enemy, Fedayeen. And to this day, they don't know exactly what happened to each one of them. So from a practical point of view, in this type of war, especially in a high-intensity war, you can't avoid it. Now, I would say in Iraq now, if you want to go around Iraq now, because the security's gotten so bad, you know, when I was there in 2003, I went to restaurants, Dexter Filkins, jogging. You know, now you go out with 2 security vehicles and your bodyguards, and there's a whole security protocol, and you can't leave Baghdad. So if you want to cover things outside Baghdad, you can either send Iraqi employees of your news organization who may not even get a byline. If there's a bombing in Samara, you can't go there. Not in return with your head. And or you embed it, which presents its own hazards, but at least you can travel around the country. So it's not a practical alternative to it. I've been unembedded too. I was unembedded in Afghanistan at Tora Bora because they didn't have embedding. You know, and I think in any beat, you have to make your own decisions about preserve your own credibility and maintain a certain objectivity. And I could cite you cases of reporters from the Washington Post and New York Times who wrote events. And there was a checkpoint incident during the war where some nervous soldiers, a van pulled up and they fired on it and killed, I think, 15 innocent Iraqis. And the captain then was screaming at the guys, "What did you do? You killed the family." They didn't mean to do it. They were afraid that they probably fired too soon. It's happened repeatedly in a situation like this. But that was reported by a Washington Post reporter. It was embedded. It didn't stop him. There was no retaliation against him. So, you know, it can be done. And I think you just have to make the same decision any reporter makes in any beat, that, you know, who's dependent on the people he's with for information.
I've watched as Tom Friedman has gotten increasingly pessimistic. On Saturday, he said we were in our 11th hour now, as far as any good outcome coming from that. And what I'm wondering is, first, the $64 question is, what do you think is going to happen? And as part of that, or follow-up to that, is there any hope whatsoever that somebody in the administration is finally going to wake up?
And do what?
That's a good question. But they will understand the mistakes that have been made and do something about it.
Well, first of all, I think if you follow the administration statements, just, you know, a lot of them are increasingly sober. Granted, they always try to present it in a positive light, but President Bush has said a few weeks ago that decisions on the withdrawal of American troops are going to be made by future. He actually said presidents in the plural. I don't know if he meant to say that, but it's certainly not going to be made by him in terms of the final withdrawal from Iraq. So I think they've made an effort to prepare the public, but this is a longer-term deal. And certainly, I think we're not all out by September 2003, is what's envisioned. So they've been in that effort. Condoleezza Rice talked about the thousands of tactical mistakes. You know, I think there's fairly sober appraisals. I think a lot of lessons have been learned. I think, you know, counterinsurgency has now become a cottage industry for the U.S. military. There was a time when the administration would even say the word insurgency. Now everyone's trying to think of counterinsurgency strategies. I think the personnel we have in Iraq on the military side, civilian side, Zalmay Khalil's on the civilian side, and the generals on the military side are good and work together, which was something that, you know, Ambassador Bremer and General Sanchez might have tried, and the more effectively, because they had some differences. And, you know, I think a lot of lessons have been learned, but the problem is a lot of time has been lost. And at this stage, this is no longer up to us. It's really up to the Iraqis. And we can play a role, but we can't decide everything for them. And a lot of it's in the political realm, and it depends on the politics of Iraq and their efforts to form a new government. And so, you know, where I personally come out, and I don't know if this audience would agree with me after all these harsh criticisms, and I don't know that I'm necessarily right either, by the way, is that, I mean, I think that, I don't think we can leave in a matter of months. I think if we did, we'd have the civil war that we've so far avoided. I don't think we have a civil war now. I think we have a lot of killing, and I think it could be a lot worse than it is now. And I think that the policy of transferring responsibility to the Iraqi military gradually and letting them combat the insurgency and trying to create some broadly representative government is the correct policy. And if I was in charge, that's what I would be doing. So I guess I'd be doing a lot of what they're now doing. And now if that doesn't work, what is the next step? And I don't know, we're not quite at that point yet. I think it can go either way. I don't think we've lost, but I don't think we necessarily, I think we still can salvage something out of it, but I don't think that's a sure thing either.
Congratulations on your book, and thanks for being here. You talk about the way the senior military were overlooked, the chiefs, for example, but there's been a fair amount of rotation since then. Most of the guys, 3 stars and 4 stars, who were in the building in 2002 have retired. And yet, that group seems to have been pretty reticent up until now. Do you have any, that is, I haven't seen them lambasting the planning process or the failure to develop phase 4 and so on. Do you have any sense about why that group has been pretty reticent?
The Joint Chiefs?
Yes, the Chiefs. And lots of other people, commanders in the field, people who appear to be speaking through you, but not speaking directly.
Well, it's a good question. In the Gulf War, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was Colin Powell, and he and Cheney did not see eye to eye. Powell, in fact, did not want to go to war for Kuwait. But once he understood that the decision had been made, he desired to make it work, and he put a lot of resources and effort into it. And in this conflict, the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't have a Colin Powell. They didn't have a forceful chairman. And I liken General Myers, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He's a very decent person. He's an intelligent person. He was not a forceful person. He was picked primarily because he was seen as a team player. And Rumsfeld didn't want any challenges from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he got to pick and recommend the person to the president. So they picked someone he thought would kind of go along with his policies. So the Joint Chiefs, if the Defense Secretary is picking somebody to be chairman because he doesn't think he'll be a strong person, which is not what Dick Cheney did, picked someone to be chairman who he thought would be a strong person, might even have some differences with. So maybe the good things will come out of that. Then you're not going to get a lot of pushback from the chiefs. And the other thing is, the other chiefs, I'm not aware that any of them had any big problems with the war. Even General Shinseki made his famous comments about the lack of forces for the post-war. Didn't fight it hard internally. Bad relationship with Rumsfeld, but he didn't press this internally. And another factor which you have to reckon here is that General Franks also didn't want the chiefs to have a role. And if you read General Franks' book, he refers in very disparaging and even profane terms about the chiefs. And he viewed them as meddlers instead of experienced people who might actually have a different perspective. And so the chiefs were marginalized. One way they did try to influence things, again, it's kind of how does he work within a system? General Casey, who's now our principal military man in Iraq, didn't have a great relationship with General Franks. He saw that Franks was doing no post-war planning. And it was quite clear that the civilians weren't doing much of it either. And Casey made an effort to stimulate some post-war planning. I recount it in the book. In the kind of the winter of 2002. And he created a task force called JTF-4. And, but it didn't pan out very well. But again, these are people sort of, General Abizaid also had concerns about that. He had a plan to make the Third Corps the post-war military headquarters and to staff them all up and pick them all in advance. Instead, what happens is we get to Iraq, question, well, who's going to be the chief military guy? And we end up with General Sanchez, who was the most junior three-star general, the last arriving division, suddenly propelled to in charge of the whole military thing, which no one anticipated at all. And the acting chief of the army was uneasy with that development. So, I do think, this is the question people usually ask at this point, why didn't the military push back enough? And that's usually the question I like to let my co-author answer, because he's a retired 3-star general. But I do think they're second guessing it in the military as to, in retrospect, the military follows civilian control, and you give them the orders and they'll do it. And they're in there, they're going to grit this out. And to my mind, if this works at all, it's going to be a credit to the military and to the Iraqis. Military for gritting it out, and the Iraqis for having the political maturity to put it together. But I don't see that the civilian policymakers had much to do with any of this. So it's that's my perspective. But I think within military circles, you're going to see over years some second guessing about whether they were a little bit too compliant. I think I'll take one more, and then we'll wrap it up.
What do you think about the U.S. mainstream media, in that they were largely uncritical of before the war began? And what do you think about how American Republicans are largely uninformed about the war and its connections with 9/11?
Well, the role of the media is not to be critical or not critical. It's just to be as conscientious as you can about the reporting and as accurate as you can. So it wasn't the media's role to stop the war or challenge the war. That said, I reflect back on it, and I think, and remember, the Congress didn't challenge the war, and the Democratic Party didn't challenge the war. But I think that, and you're dealing with an administration that has a penchant for secrecy. But I still think that some of the issues that we confronted in Iraq could have been better handled by the media, including the post-war planning issues and the situation in Iraq. And I would put myself in that category. I'm not exempting myself from criticism. I mean, you can always do better. Was there a second part of that?
Just how the American public has been misinformed about a connection with
Oh.
9/11.
Well, I mean, the CIA took the position in the National Intelligence Estimate of 2002 that there was no link between Saddam and terrorist groups. He would never give them WMD, and it was a matter of public record before the congressional vote. Senator Carl Levin, and Senator Graham of Florida made that public and declassified. I think, I don't know. I mean, it's just a matter of public record. There's no link between Saddam and 9/11 in a direct sense. I think that if you listen to the administration really carefully, what they were saying is a little different. It's that in a world in which you can have 9/11s, their view was that it was too great a risk to have states that produce WMD give WMD to terrorists who could attack us. I think the form of the argument has a logic to it, but the facts in the case of Iraq were off. So at that point, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Just a slight gloss on Michael's response to Dean Doran's question that he mentioned General Casey. He was one of those nation builders and had a little bit of experience with nation building before he came into that. And I think that tells you a little bit about, as you look at the personalities and how different people approached it, as people who understood some of those challenges and had experienced them before, General Zinni and others, tend to have a more realistic assessment of what this might require. I think you'll all share my view that, as always, Michael has given us an extraordinarily informative and thoughtful assessment of an issue that obviously raises a lot of interest and passion. But I think having this kind of detailed understanding and really remarkably well documented, I don't know whether it's legal under UT and Texas laws to promote books, but it's a great book, and you'll know what to do in response to that, especially because, as he told you, there are parts of it that he can't put in the New York Times, and so the only way to find out what's in it is to go and get the book. So once again, thank you very much, Michael Ward.
you.